The war in the Pacific had reached a turning point that few could have anticipated in those dark days following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nearly 3 full years had passed since that infamous morning when Japanese carrier planes struck the American naval base in Hawaii, and the entire strategic picture had undergone a transformation so complete that it seemed almost impossible. What had begun as a desperate defensive struggle for the United States had evolved into a methodical, grinding offensive campaign that was pushing inexorably toward the Japanese home islands themselves. The American military machine, once reeling from defeat after defeat across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, had reorganized, rearmed, and reinvented its approach to warfare in this theater of operations. The strategy that the American command had adopted was one of calculated aggression, a technique that would later become known as island hopping. Rather than attempting to recapture every single piece of territory that Japan had seized in its initial rampage across the Pacific, American forces would instead select key strategic points, bypass heavily defended positions that offered little strategic value, and leap forward from one island base to the next. Each captured island became a stepping stone, a new airfield, a new anchorage, a new supply depot that brought American power one step closer to the Japanese homeland. It was a strategy that required patience, coordination, and an enormous commitment of resources, but it was working. Month by month, the noose was tightening around Japan's defensive perimeter. By the summer of 1944, this methodical advance had brought American forces to the Mariana Islands, a chain of strategic positions that lay deep within what the Japanese military planners considered their inner defensive ring. The specific target was Saipan, an island that held significance far beyond its small size. The Japanese High Command understood with crystal clarity what the fall of Saipan would mean for their war effort. It was not merely another lost outpost in a string of defeats. The capture of Saipan would represent a catastrophic breach in Japan's defences, because the island sat at precisely the right distance from the Japanese home islands to serve as a base for the new American heavy bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. These massive aircraft, the most advanced bombers in the world at that time, had the range to strike deep into Japan itself if they could operate from bases in the Marianas. Japanese cities, which had thus far remained largely untouched by the war despite Japan's aggression across Asia, would suddenly find themselves within reach of American strategic bombing campaigns. The implications were staggering. If Saipan fell, Japan's major urban centres would be exposed to the kind of sustained aerial bombardment that had been devastating German cities in Europe. The protective shield that distance had provided would be shattered. Factories, shipyards, military installations, and the civilian population itself would become targets. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters recognized that they could not allow this to happen without committing every available resource to prevent it. The decision was made to gamble everything on one massive naval engagement to throw the remaining strength of the Japanese combined fleet into a desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion force and save Saipan. The architect of this plan was Admiral Toyoda Suemu, who held overall command of the combined fleet. He designated the operation with the code name A-Go, which translates roughly to Operation Ego in English, though it carried different connotations in Japanese military terminology. The concept behind the operation drew heavily on traditional Japanese naval doctrine, particularly the philosophy of Kantai Kessen, which envisioned a single decisive fleet engagement that would determine the outcome of the war at sea. For generations, Japanese naval planners had studied and prepared for such a battle, imagining a scenario where the Imperial Navy would meet its adversary in one climactic confrontation and achieve victory through superior training, tactics, and fighting spirit. Now, in the summer of 1944, they believed that moment had arrived, even though the strategic circumstances were far less favourable than they had ever imagined in their pre-war planning. The actual execution of the operation fell to Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, a capable and experienced officer who would be leading what remained of Japan's carrier striking force into battle. The force that Ozawa assembled represented virtually everything that Japan could still put to sea in terms of carrier aviation. He commanded 9 aircraft carriers of various sizes and capabilities, from the large fleet carriers that had been the pride of the Japanese Navy to smaller converted vessels that had been pressed into service as the war situation deteriorated. These carriers collectively embarked approximately 500 aircraft, though the quality and experience level of the pilots varied dramatically from the elite veterans who had survived multiple campaigns to newly trained aviators who had received abbreviated training due to Japan's increasingly desperate shortage of fuel and experienced instructors. Supporting these carriers was a substantial surface force built around 5 battleships, massive vessels armed with the largest naval guns in the world. These battleships represented an enormous investment in resources and industrial capacity, but their role in modern naval warfare had become increasingly peripheral as the aircraft carrier emerged as the dominant weapon system. Nevertheless, they provided powerful anti-aircraft protection and could deliver devastating gunfire if they ever got within range of enemy vessels. The force also included 13 cruisers, ships that combined speed, firepower, and versatility, capable of screening the carriers, engaging enemy surface units, or providing anti-aircraft support as needed. More than 30 destroyers completed the formation, serving as the eyes and ears of the fleet, protecting against submarine attacks, and adding their own lighter weapons to the collective defensive firepower of the formation. Beyond the ships themselves, Ozawa counted on additional support from land-based aircraft stationed on islands throughout the region. Roughly 300 planes were positioned on various bases in the area, ready to coordinate their attacks with the carrier strikes. In theory, this combined force of carrier and land-based aviation would overwhelm the American fleet through sheer numbers and coordinated attacks from multiple directions. It was a sound concept, but it relied on assumptions about aircraft performance, pilot quality, and American defensive capabilities that would prove to be tragically outdated. Opposing this Japanese force was the United States Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, one of the most capable naval commanders in American history. Spruance had proven his abilities at the Battle of Midway 2 years earlier, where his calm decision-making under pressure had contributed significantly to that crucial American victory. Now he commanded an armada that dwarfed anything the Japanese could assemble. The carrier striking force, designated Task Force 58, was under the direct command of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, an aviator who understood carrier operations from the deck level up to strategic planning. Mitcher was known for his calm demeanor under pressure and his willingness to take calculated risks to achieve victory. The American carrier force consisted of 15 flat tops, ranging from the large fleet carriers of the Essex class to smaller escort carriers that provided additional aircraft capacity. These carriers collectively embarked nearly 900 aircraft, almost double the number that Ozawa could field. More importantly, the quality of American aircraft had improved dramatically since the beginning of the war. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter had been specifically designed to counter the Japanese Zero, and it had proven itself superior in virtually every combat situation. American torpedo bombers and dive bombers had also improved, becoming more reliable and more capable than their predecessors. The American advantage in numbers was compounded by an advantage in equipment quality. The surface fleet protecting these carriers was equally impressive. 7 fast battleships, modern vessels designed to keep pace with the carriers and provide massive anti-aircraft firepower, formed an inner defensive ring. 21 cruisers added their weapons to the defensive screen, while nearly 60 destroyers patrolled the perimeter, ready to intercept any threat that approached the formation. The American ships were equipped with the latest radar systems, allowing them to detect incoming aircraft at distances that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. They also carried proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, a technological breakthrough that dramatically increased the lethality of anti-aircraft fire by detonating automatically when near an aircraft, rather than requiring a direct hit. Both commanders understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The coming naval battle would not be decided by battleship guns dueling at long range, as naval engagements had been fought for centuries. Instead, it would be an aerial contest, with hundreds of aircraft clashing in the skies above the Philippine Sea, while the ships themselves remained far beyond visual range of each other. The outcome would determine not just the fate of Saipan and the Marianas, but the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. If Japan could achieve a miracle and destroy or cripple the American carrier force, it might buy time to strengthen defences elsewhere and negotiate some kind of settlement short of total defeat. If the Americans prevailed, as most objective observers expected, then Japan's situation would become truly desperate, with no naval force capable of preventing American advances anywhere in the Pacific. What nobody could predict was just how one-sided the outcome would be. The battle that was about to unfold would go down in history with a name that captured both its scale and its shocking disparity in results. Future generations would remember it as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a darkly humorous reference to the ease with which American fighters would swat Japanese aircraft from the sky. But on that June morning in 1944, as both fleets manoeuvred into position, the outcome was still uncertain in the minds of the men who would fight the battle. The dawn of June 19, 1944, broke clear and warm over the Philippine Sea. Aboard the Japanese flagship Taiho, the newest and most advanced carrier in the Imperial Navy, Vice Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge, his gaze sweeping across the horizon toward the east, where he knew the American fleet must be positioned. The Taiho was a source of considerable pride for the Japanese Navy, incorporating design improvements and lessons learned from earlier carriers. She was larger, better protected, and more capable than most of the other carriers in the fleet. Ozawa had transferred his flag to this vessel specifically because of its advanced communications equipment and improved survivability features. Standing on her bridge as the sun rose, he felt confident that his force would give a good account of itself in the coming battle. At precisely 4:45 in the morning, Ozawa gave the order for the first reconnaissance aircraft to launch. These scout planes would fan out across the ocean, searching for any sign of the American fleet. It was standard procedure before any major engagement, the need to locate the enemy before committing your striking force to an attack. Almost simultaneously, though neither side knew it yet, American carriers were launching their own reconnaissance aircraft. The two fleets were feeling for each other in the darkness, trying to gain the first crucial advantage of finding the enemy before being found themselves. The Japanese scouts had been airborne for just over an hour when one of them, a Mitsubishi Zero fighter configured for reconnaissance duties, spotted the American fleet through breaks in the cloud cover. The pilot, his heart racing with the excitement of his discovery, immediately transmitted the coordinates back to the flagship. He had found them. The target that the entire Japanese fleet had been seeking was now located and identified. But this particular pilot, whether through an excess of aggressive spirit or a lack of tactical judgment, decided not to simply observe and report. Instead, he pushed his control stick forward and dove toward the formation below, selecting one of the American destroyers as his target. It was a brave but foolish decision. As he descended, every anti-aircraft gun on the destroyer and nearby ships opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and explosive shells. The Zero, despite the skill of its pilot, stood no chance against such concentrated fire. Within moments, it was hit multiple times, flames erupting from its engine cowling. The aircraft tumbled from the sky and plunged into the ocean, taking its pilot with it. It was a minor incident in the grand scheme of the battle to come, but it marked the first blood, the opening act of what would become one of the largest naval engagements in history. The destruction of that scout plane sent alarm bells ringing through the American fleet. If Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were overhead, it meant the enemy carriers had to be relatively close, probably within striking range. On Guam, one of the islands in the Marianas chain that was still under Japanese control, air base commanders received urgent messages to prepare their aircraft for immediate launch. These land-based planes were supposed to coordinate with Ozawa's carrier strikes to overwhelm the American defenses with attacks from multiple directions. Pilots and ground crews rushed to get bombers and fighters ready for takeoff, fueling aircraft and loading weapons as quickly as possible. But the Americans had not been idle. Their radar systems, far superior to anything the Japanese possessed, had already detected the unusual activity around Guam's airfields. On the carrier Belleau Wood, alarm klaxons sounded and pilots sprinted to their waiting F-6F Hellcat fighters. Within minutes, the first Hellcats were roaring down the flight deck and climbing into the morning sky, forming up into combat formations as they headed toward Guam. The Japanese pilots on Rota Airfield, a smaller base nearby, were still in the process of taking off when the American fighters arrived overhead like avenging angels. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. The Japanese aircraft, caught in the vulnerable moments of takeoff and climb, were easy prey for the Hellcats diving from above. American pilots, their training emphasizing energy tactics and disciplined gunnery, made repeated passes through the disorganized Japanese formation. The sound of machine gun fire echoed across the airfield as one Japanese plane after another fell from the sky or exploded on the ground. Some pilots managed to get airborne and attempted to fight back, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched. The F-6F Hellcat was a rugged, powerful fighter with excellent climbing ability, heavy armament and armor protection that allowed it to absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. In the hands of well-trained American pilots, it was a deadly weapon. The engagement lasted less than a full hour, but by the time the American fighters broke off and returned to their carriers, the results were devastating for Japan. 35 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, either shot down in the air or caught on the ground. The Americans had lost exactly one Hellcat, and its pilot had been rescued from the ocean by a destroyer. The survivors of the Japanese formation, those few pilots who had managed to escape the aerial ambush, abandoned any thought of continuing their mission and fled back to base. With this threat eliminated, the American commanders could now focus their full attention on the main Japanese carrier force that they knew was approaching from the west. On the bridge of the carrier Lexington, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher maintained his characteristic calm demeanor as reports flowed in from across the task force. Mitcher was not a man given to dramatic gestures or emotional displays. He had spent decades in naval aviation, rising through the ranks by demonstrating competence, judgment, and an unflappable temperament under pressure. Now, as he prepared to face the largest carrier battle of his career, he radiated quiet confidence that transmitted itself to everyone around him. His eyes moved constantly between the radar displays, the status boards showing aircraft positions, and the view through the bridge windows where the other ships of his task force were visible in their precise formations. At 8:30 in the morning, a watch officer called out a report that made everyone on the bridge turn toward the radar screen. Hundreds of contacts were appearing on the display, approaching from the west. The images were unmistakable, a massive formation of aircraft heading directly toward the American fleet. Ozawa had launched his strike, committing a huge portion of his available aircraft to this first attack wave. In his operations center, Japanese controllers were coordinating 3 separate groups from different parts of the fleet. The first group, designated Force C, consisted of 69 aircraft. The second and largest group, from Force A, comprised 128 aircraft. The third group, from Force B, added another 47 planes to the total. In less than an hour, the Japanese had put 244 aircraft into the air, all heading toward the same target, the American carrier force. By 10 o'clock in the morning, American radar operators were tracking the first wave with increasing precision. The contacts were now just 240 kilometers away and closing steadily. Mitcher wasted no time issuing orders. Every Hellcat fighter that could get airborne was to launch immediately. Pilots who had been on patrol near Guam received urgent recall orders to return to the fleet and join the defensive effort. The American carriers became scenes of controlled chaos as aircraft handlers and deck crews worked at maximum efficiency to get fighters into the air. One after another, Hellcats rolled down the flight decks, their powerful engines roaring as they clawed for altitude and formed into defensive formations at various altitudes around the fleet. In the lead Japanese formation, a pilot named Masatoshi Nakagawa commanded a group of Aichi dive bombers, aircraft designed to attack ships by diving nearly vertically and releasing bombs at the last possible moment for maximum accuracy. Nakagawa was an experienced aviator who had survived multiple combat missions, and he understood the dangers of attacking an American carrier force. The anti-aircraft fire would be intense, and American fighters would do everything possible to break up the attack before it reached the ships. But he also believed in his mission and in the importance of what they were attempting to accomplish. If they could sink or cripple even a few American carriers, it would be worth the sacrifice. As the formation approached to within about 100 kilometers of its target, Nakagawa made a decision that would have fatal consequences. He ordered the formation to slow down and regroup, ensuring that all the aircraft were in proper attack formation before making their final approach. It seemed like a reasonable tactical decision, taking a few extra minutes to organize properly rather than arriving piecemeal and disorganized. But those few minutes of hovering in one area, with aircraft circling and reforming, gave American radar operators a perfect stationary target to vector fighters toward, and the Hellcats were coming. At exactly 10:36 in the morning, American fighters struck from above. They had climbed to altitude and positioned themselves up-sun from the Japanese formation, using the glare to mask their approach until the last possible moment. When they dove to attack, the Japanese pilots barely had time to react. The sky erupted into a chaotic whirlwind of aircraft, tracers, and explosions. Hellcats made high-speed diving passes through the Japanese formation, their 650 caliber machine guns pouring fire into enemy aircraft. Within just a few minutes, 25 Japanese planes had been shot down, spiraling into the ocean in flames or disintegrating in mid-air. The Americans lost one Hellcat in this initial clash, but the carnage was far from over. As the Japanese formation attempted to reorganize and continue toward their target, the Hellcats attacked again and again. Another 16 aircraft fell from the sky. The survivors, their carefully planned attack formation completely disrupted, faced an impossible decision. They could continue pressing toward the American fleet, knowing they would have to fight through more waves of defenders and then face the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the ships themselves, or they could abort the mission and try to save themselves. Many pilots, their nerves shattered by the ferocity of the American defense, chose survival. They jettisoned their bombs into the ocean, lightening their aircraft and improving their chances of outrunning the pursuing Hellcats. A handful of Japanese pilots, the bravest or most determined, or perhaps simply those who had no other option, managed to break through the fighter screen and continue toward the American ships. What they encountered there was unlike anything they had experienced before. The Americans had been developing their anti-aircraft defenses for years, incorporating lessons learned from every engagement. The result was a defensive system of almost unimaginable lethality. As the surviving Japanese aircraft approached the fleet, hundreds of guns opened fire simultaneously. 5-inch guns, the main anti-aircraft armament on battleships and cruisers, filled the sky with proximity-fused shells that exploded automatically when they sensed an aircraft nearby. 40mm Bofors guns, arranged in quad mounts across every major ship, created walls of tracers. Smaller 20mm cannon added their fire to the maelstrom. The air itself seemed to solidify with flying metal. One particularly determined or perhaps simply lucky Japanese bomber managed to penetrate this defensive barrage and released its bomb directly over the battleship South Dakota. The weapon plunged down and struck the massive warship's deck with a tremendous explosion that shook the vessel from stem to stern. Fires erupted and more than 50 sailors were killed or wounded in the blast. For a moment it seemed the attack might inflict serious damage, but the South Dakota had been designed to absorb precisely this kind of punishment. Her heavy armor plating contained the blast, preventing it from penetrating to vital spaces below. Damage control parties rushed to the scene, dragging fire hoses and bringing the flames under control within minutes. The battleship, though scarred and bloodied, remained fully capable of continuing the fight. That single hit represented the only success the first Japanese wave would achieve. Not a single bomb or torpedo touched any of the precious American carriers. By the time the survivors turned for home, the mathematics of the engagement were brutal. Of the 69 aircraft that had launched in this first wave, 42 had been destroyed. Only 27 made it back to their carriers, many of those damaged and several so badly shot up that they would never fly again. It was a catastrophic loss rate, the kind of attrition that no air force could sustain for more than a few battles before ceasing to exist as an effective fighting force. On the carrier Zuikaku, one of the veteran flat-tops that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived numerous subsequent battles, Japanese deck crews worked frantically to prepare aircraft for another strike. Despite the ominous silence from the first wave, whose losses were not yet fully known to the fleet commanders, Ozawa remained committed to his plan. He believed that sheer numbers and determination would eventually overwhelm the American defences. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he issued orders for a second massive strike to launch. This time, 129 aircraft would participate, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. It represented a huge commitment of his remaining air strength, but Ozawa felt he had no choice. The Americans had to be stopped before they could consolidate their hold on Saipan. As midday approached, American radar operators once again saw their screens light up with incoming contacts. The time was 11:07, and another massive formation of Japanese aircraft was approaching from the southwest. Mitchell's response was identical to before. Every available Hellcat was ordered into the air, and those already flying were vectored toward the incoming threat. The American pilots, many of whom had already shot down Japanese planes during the morning's first engagement, climbed eagerly to intercept this new wave. The second Japanese formation never even got close to the American fleet. At a distance of 60 miles, roughly 97 kilometers from the nearest American ship, they ran into a solid wall of Hellcats. The American fighters, guided by radar controllers who could see the entire battle developing on their screens, positioned themselves perfectly to intercept. As the two formations merged, the sky filled with hundreds of aircraft twisting, turning, diving, and climbing in desperate combat. But it was a hopelessly one-sided contest. American pilots, better trained, better equipped, and fighting with tactical advantages provided by radar direction, tore through the Japanese formation with devastating efficiency. Within just a few minutes, approximately 70 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. The formation, already badly mauled, broke apart as individual pilots tried to save themselves or pressed on alone toward the target. A small group of 6 dive bombers somehow managed to evade the fighters and reached the outer edge of Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery's task group. They selected the carriers Wasp and Bunker Hill as their targets and dove to attack, releasing their bombs in steep dives as they had been trained. The bombs fell close enough that massive columns of water erupted alongside both carriers, drenching their decks and starting small fires from burning debris. Several sailors were killed or wounded by shrapnel, but neither carrier took a direct hit. The bombs had missed by just meters, but in naval warfare, a miss is as good as a mile. The damage was minor, quickly contained, and both carriers continued operations without interruption. Another group of Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers, known to the Americans by the code name Jill, attempted a more coordinated attack on the carrier Enterprise. This particular ship held special significance for the Japanese. Enterprise had become almost legendary, participating in virtually every major carrier battle of the war and somehow surviving when so many other ships had been sunk. Japanese pilots had been told repeatedly that sinking the Enterprise would be a major victory. Now they had their chance. The torpedo bombers spread out and approached from multiple angles, hoping to catch the carrier in a crossfire of torpedoes that would be impossible to dodge. But the attack was poorly coordinated, probably because the formation had been broken up by fighter attacks on the way in. Enterprise's captain, an experienced officer who had maneuvered the ship through countless attacks, calmly ordered a series of turns that allowed the big carrier to evade every torpedo. The Japanese weapons churned through the water where the ship would have been if it had maintained its original course, but Enterprise had already moved, leaving nothing but empty ocean. 3 more torpedo bombers attempted to attack the carrier Princeton, but they never got close enough to release their weapons. Anti-aircraft fire from Princeton and her escorts simply blew them out of the sky as soon as they appeared. The wreckage splashed into the ocean, adding to the growing debris field that marked where the battle had been fought. By the time the second wave attack had ended, the Japanese had suffered even more catastrophic losses than in the first wave. 97 of the 129 aircraft that had launched never returned to their carriers. The survivors limped home, many trailing smoke or struggling with damaged engines, to report yet another failed attack. At noon, the sun beat down mercilessly on the Philippine Sea, its brilliant light reflecting off patches of oil that marked where aircraft had crashed into the water. The ocean's surface was littered with debris, life rafts, and the occasional survivor clinging to floating wreckage. Despite these clear signs of disaster, despite the fact that more than 2/3 of his aircraft were now gone, Ozawa had not yet given up. The Japanese concept of Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized honor and perseverance over practical considerations, would not allow him to simply retreat in the face of adversity. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he ordered yet another strike to launch. This time, 47 aircraft took off from carriers to the north of the main force, hoping to attack the American fleet from an unexpected direction and perhaps catch them by surprise. The element of surprise did not materialize. American radar detected this third wave while it was still 80 kilometers from the fleet, plenty of time to scramble interceptors. 40 Hellcats roared up to meet them, and the resulting aerial combat was brief and violent. The Japanese pilots, many of them among the least experienced in the fleet, found themselves completely outmatched. Some tried to fight, others attempted to flee, but the Hellcats hunted them relentlessly. In the chaotic swirl of combat, only 7 Japanese aircraft were actually shot down, fewer than in the earlier waves. But the entire formation broke apart under the assault, and the survivors, their morale shattered, jettisoned their bombs and torpedoes into the sea before fleeing back toward their carriers. 40 planes managed to return safely, a much better survival rate than the earlier waves, but they had accomplished absolutely nothing. They had not even gotten close enough to the American fleet to see the ships, let alone attack them. Ozawa, still desperate to achieve something from this operation, committed his final reserves to one last attempt. Between 11 and 11:30 in the morning, the carriers launched a fourth strike consisting of 84 aircraft. This represented virtually everything he had left. Every serviceable plane, every pilot who could still fly, was thrown into this final gamble. But fate, which had already been cruel to the Japanese throughout the day, now delivered an almost darkly comic final blow. The intelligence that Ozawa's staff had provided to the strike leaders was simply wrong. The coordinates they had been given for the American fleet were miles off from the actual position. The strike formation flew to the designated location and found nothing but empty ocean. As the pilots searched frantically for their target, their fuel gauges steadily dropped toward empty. Modern aircraft, unlike ships, cannot simply stop when they are lost. They must keep flying, keep burning fuel, until they find somewhere to land or fall from the sky. The strike commander, realizing that his force would never find the Americans in time, made the painful decision to split the formation. One group would fly to Guam, the other to Rota, where they could refuel before attempting to return to the carriers. It seemed like a reasonable plan given the circumstances, but the withdrawal phase of the mission would prove even more deadly than a conventional attack. The group heading toward Rota had the misfortune of flying directly over Rear Admiral Montgomery's task group while trying to find their way to the airfield. American radar picked them up immediately, and Hellcats scrambled to intercept. The Japanese pilots, low on fuel and desperately trying to reach safety, had no choice but to fight their way through. 18 aircraft became engaged in a running battle with the American fighters. 9 managed to escape by diving for the deck and using every trick they knew to evade pursuit. The other 9 were shot down, their pilots dying within sight of the base they had been trying to reach. Meanwhile, 9 dive bombers from the formation made one last desperate attempt to inflict some damage before heading to safety. They spotted the carriers Wasp and Bunker Hill, the same ships that had been targeted earlier in the day, and dove to attack. Their bombs splashed into the water close alongside both carriers, throwing up enormous geysers that looked spectacular but caused no significant damage. American anti-aircraft gunners, by now thoroughly warmed up and experienced from the day's earlier engagements, shot down 8 of the 9 attackers. Only a single dive bomber escaped, its pilot somehow threading through the storm of fire and making it safely to Guam. Speaking of Guam, the aircraft heading there encountered an even worse fate. As the surviving Japanese planes approached the airfield to land and refuel, they were completely focused on getting down safely. Fuel gauges were reading empty, engines were sputtering, and some aircraft had battle damage that made flying difficult. The pilots were undoubtedly relieved to see the airfield below them and began setting up for landing approaches. What they did not know was that 27 Hellcats from American carriers had been orbiting just out of sight, waiting for exactly this moment. The American fighters swept in like wolves among sheep. Japanese aircraft were caught in their landing patterns, vulnerable and unable to maneuver effectively. Some were shot down while trying to land, others were destroyed moments after touching down and while still rolling to a stop. A few pilots managed to get down safely and tried to take off again to fight back, but they were overwhelmed before they could gain altitude. Within minutes, 30 more Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, and many of the survivors were so badly shot up that they would never fly combat missions again. Mechanics inspecting the damaged planes later reported that some had more than 100 bullet holes. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on that June 19th, the smoke of battle was finally beginning to clear. The ocean was littered with wreckage, oil slicks, and the occasional life raft containing survivors. The tally of destruction was almost incomprehensible. In just a single day of combat, Japan had suffered losses that would have been considered catastrophic even over the course of an entire campaign. Approximately 330 aircraft had been destroyed. This total included nearly all of the land-based planes that had been stationed in the Marianas to support the operation, as well as almost half of the carrier air groups that Ozawa had commanded. The pilots who had died represented years of training and accumulated combat experience that could never be replaced. In stark contrast, American losses had been minimal, almost to the point of being negligible. 23 aircraft had been lost during the day's combat, and even those losses were primarily due to operational accidents rather than enemy action. Several pilots had crashed while landing back on their carriers in the confusion of recovering so many aircraft simultaneously. The fleet itself had suffered only minor damage. The battleship South Dakota had taken that one bomb hit, resulting in casualties but no significant impairment of the ship's combat capability. A few other vessels had suffered minor damage from near misses. Overall, the American task force was just as capable of fighting on June 20th as it had been on June 18th. The fleet had absorbed everything Japan could throw at it and emerged virtually unscathed. Watching the endless stream of Japanese aircraft falling from the sky throughout that long June day, one American pilot had radioed a comment to his wingman that would become immortalized in the history books. The sky was so thick with falling enemy planes, the combat so one-sided, that it reminded him of a turkey shoot back home, those competitions where turkeys would be released and hunters would try to shoot as many as possible. The comparison was darkly appropriate. Japanese aircraft, many flown by poorly trained pilots in obsolete machines, had been swatted from the sky with almost contemptuous ease. From that moment forward, the battle acquired its famous nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, the elite of Japan's naval aviation had been virtually wiped out, and the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted so decisively that Japan would never again be able to mount a serious carrier offensive. But as night fell across the Philippine Sea, the battle was not yet over. While the fierce aerial combat had been raging above the waves, another deadly contest had been unfolding beneath the surface. American submarines, operating independently but coordinating their efforts through radio reports, had been stalking Ozawa's fleet since before the battle began. Submarine warfare in the Pacific had evolved into a highly effective campaign of attrition against Japanese shipping, and the presence of such a lucrative target as the Japanese carrier force was an opportunity that submarine commanders were eager to exploit. Early that morning, even as the first aircraft were launching for their doomed attacks, the American submarine Albacore had detected Ozawa's flagship Taiho through her periscope. Commander James Blanchard, the submarine's captain, could hardly believe his luck. Through the periscope's optics, he could see one of the largest carriers in the Japanese fleet, surrounded by escorts but still within range. He maneuvered his boat into an attack position, calculating angles and ranges, while his crew loaded torpedoes and prepared for the shot. The process required patience and precision. A submarine could not simply shoot at any target it saw. The captain had to position the boat to give the torpedoes the best possible chance of hitting, which meant predicting where the target would be when the torpedoes arrived after their run through the water. At precisely 8:15 in the morning, just as Taiho's deck crews were launching aircraft for the second strike wave, Blanchard gave the order to fire. 6 torpedoes burst from Albacore's forward tubes and accelerated towards their target. Aboard Taiho, alert lookouts spotted the characteristic white wakes of torpedoes approaching through the clear tropical water. Alarm bells rang throughout the ship, and the captain ordered an emergency turn to try to avoid the incoming weapons. Escorting destroyers immediately began dropping depth charges, hoping to either destroy the submarine or at least disrupt its attack. In the chaos of those few seconds, an extraordinary act of self-sacrifice occurred. A Japanese pilot named Sakio Komatsu had just taken off from Taiho's deck in his fighter. As he climbed away from the carrier, he spotted one of the torpedoes running just below the surface, aimed directly at his ship. Without hesitation, Komatsu pushed his control stick forward and deliberately crashed his aircraft into the torpedo, detonating it harmlessly short of the carrier. His sacrifice bought Taiho a few more hours of life, but it could not save the ship entirely. Another torpedo from the same spread managed to evade the carrier's emergency turn and slammed into Taiho's starboard side, tearing a massive hole in the hull below the waterline. Aviation fuel stored in tanks near the point of impact began flooding into compartments throughout that section of the ship. It was serious damage, but not immediately fatal. Taiho had been designed with improved damage control features, including better compartmentalization and pumping systems. Her crew believed they could keep the ship afloat and even continue operations. For the next several hours, Taiho continued to steam with the fleet and even recovered aircraft returning from the failed strike missions. The ship seemed to have survived the worst. Meanwhile, another American submarine was stalking different prey. The USS Kavala, under Commander Herman Kostler, had been shadowing the veteran carrier Shokaku for hours. This particular carrier held enormous historical significance. Shokaku had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, had fought at the Coral Sea and multiple other battles, and had somehow survived everything the Americans had thrown at her. She represented the pride of the Japanese carrier force, a symbol of the fleet's power and reach. Now, at midday on June 19th, while Shokaku was busy recovering aircraft and refueling them for potential further strikes, Kavala moved in for the kill. At 11:23 in the morning, Kostler fired a spread of torpedoes at point-blank range. There was no time for Shokaku to evade. At least 3 torpedoes struck home along the carrier's port side, the explosions tearing enormous holes in the hull and rupturing fuel and ammunition storage areas. The hangar deck, crowded with aircraft being serviced and refueled, erupted into a massive fireball as aviation fuel ignited. Within minutes, the fires were completely out of control, spreading through the ship despite the desperate efforts of damage control parties. The heat became so intense that paint blistered on metal surfaces far from the actual flames. Ammunition began cooking off, adding secondary explosions to the conflagration. Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, the ship's commanding officer, understood that his vessel was doomed, At 2:08 in the afternoon, less than 3 hours after being hit, a final catastrophic explosion tore Shokaku apart. The massive carrier, veteran of so many battles, literally broke in half and began sinking rapidly. The evacuation had been hampered by the fires and explosions, and more than 1,200 sailors and airmen went down with their ship. About 570 survivors, including Captain Matsubara himself, were pulled from the water by escorting destroyers. The loss of Shokaku was a devastating blow to Japanese morale as well as combat capability. Back on Taiho, the situation that had seemed under control was rapidly deteriorating. For hours, damage control parties had been working to contain the flooding and manage the aviation fuel that had leaked into various compartments. They sealed bulkheads, activated pumping systems, and flooded some spaces with carbon dioxide to prevent fires. But then a junior damage control officer, lacking experience with such situations, made a fatal decision. Concerned about the concentration of gasoline fumes throughout the ship, he ordered the ventilation systems run at maximum power to clear the air. It seemed logical, but it was exactly the wrong thing to do. Instead of venting the fumes overboard, the powerful ventilation system simply distributed them throughout every space in the ship, creating a floating bomb. At 5:32 in the afternoon, approximately 9 hours after the initial torpedo hit, a single spark from an electrical generator ignited the gasoline-air mixture that filled Taiho's interior spaces. The explosion was beyond catastrophic. A series of massive detonations ripped through the ship from stem to stern, tearing apart elevators, blowing out the flight deck, and sending flames hundreds of meters into the sky. The blast was so powerful that it could be seen and heard from ships miles away. Taiho, the pride of the Japanese fleet and Ozawa's flagship, shook violently as her internal structure failed. Within minutes, the massive carrier was sinking, her bow already underwater and her stern rising into the air. Admiral Ozawa barely escaped with his life, transferring to a destroyer just before the ship's final plunge. The carrier went down with more than 1,600 of her crew, a terrible toll that added to the day's already horrific casualty count. In a single day, Japan had lost 2 of its most important carriers to submarine attacks, ships that had survived numerous battles only to be sunk in a matter of hours. The submarines had accomplished what Japanese planners had always feared, striking at the heart of the fleet when it was most vulnerable and inflicting damage out of all proportion to the size of the attacking force. As dawn broke on June 20th, after a night filled with damage control efforts, rescue operations, and the grim task of accounting for losses, the remnants of Ozawa's force were retreating westward. The admiral hoped to escape further engagement and preserve what little remained of his fleet. But the Americans were not content to let the Japanese withdraw without further punishment. Admiral Spruance ordered his fleet to pursue at full speed, maintaining the chase through the night. It was a calculated risk, as high-speed night sailing could lead to confusion, collisions, or blundering into an ambush. But Spruance was confident that his force could handle any remaining Japanese resistance. By morning on the 20th, dozens of American scout planes were fanning out across thousands of square miles of ocean, searching for any sign of the fleeing Japanese fleet. On the carrier Zuikaku, now serving as Ozawa's flagship after the loss of Taiho, the Japanese admiral finally received full reports of the previous day's disaster. It was only then that he learned the true extent of his losses. All 4 attack waves had been annihilated. His carrier air groups, which had numbered around 500 aircraft at the start of the battle, were now reduced to approximately 150 operational planes, and many of those were damaged or had mechanical problems. The experienced pilots who had survived were exhausted and demoralized. What Ozawa did not know, because his subordinate commanders had deliberately concealed the information from him, was that virtually all of the land-based aircraft that were supposed to have supported his operation had also been destroyed. The bases on Guam and Rota, which should have had nearly 300 planes ready to coordinate attacks with his carriers, were now smoking ruins with only a handful of flyable aircraft remaining. His officers had apparently decided that giving him this information would serve no purpose other than to further lower morale, so they had simply not reported it. Operating in ignorance of his true situation, Ozawa actually considered mounting another major strike on June 21st. In his mind, if he still had the land-based aircraft to support him, perhaps one more coordinated attack could achieve something, but any such plans became irrelevant as the day progressed. All morning, American reconnaissance aircraft searched without success, returning to their carriers with negative reports. On the flagship Lexington, Admiral Mitscher grew increasingly frustrated. Every hour that passed allowed the Japanese to get farther away. The opportunity to inflict a decisive defeat, the kind of victory that could end Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force, was slipping away. Then, at 3:40 in the afternoon, a scout plane from USS Enterprise finally spotted the Japanese fleet on the horizon. The pilot, his voice crackling with excitement, transmitted a hasty contact report giving the approximate location of the enemy ships. Mitscher immediately demanded precise coordinates. The scout's initial report had been too vague to launch an effective strike. At 4:05, the confirmation arrived with exact position data. The Japanese fleet was 275 miles to the west, steaming at 20 knots in an attempt to escape. Mitscher glanced at his watch, then at the sun hanging low in the western sky. Sunset would occur around 6:30, leaving barely more than 2 hours of daylight. An attack at this range would be extraordinarily risky. The strike aircraft would be flying at the absolute limit of their combat radius. They would almost certainly have to return after dark, attempting the difficult and dangerous task of landing on a carrier at night after an exhausting combat mission. Many planes would likely run out of fuel before reaching the carriers. Pilots would be forced to ditch in the ocean or attempt night landings for which they had received minimal training. Despite all these risks, Mitscher made his decision without hesitation. The opportunity to destroy the remnants of the Japanese carrier force was too valuable to pass up, even if it meant accepting heavy losses among his own aircraft. He issued orders across the entire Task Force 58, launch everything. Within minutes, the decks of American carriers erupted into frenzied activity as nearly every flyable aircraft was prepared for immediate launch. Mechanics made last-minute checks, armourers loaded weapons, and pilots sprinted to their waiting planes. The sheer scale of the operation was impressive. In total, 226 aircraft took off for the Sunset Strike. 95 Hellcat fighters armed with 500-pound bombs, 54 Avenger torpedo bombers, and 77 dive bombers of both the Helldiver and Dauntless types. Wave after wave climbed into the late afternoon sky, formed into combat formations, and headed west in pursuit of the fleeing Japanese. The pilots knew they were flying into a situation where their greatest danger might not be enemy fire, but simple fuel exhaustion on the return flight. Nevertheless, they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that they had a chance to deliver a knockout blow to Japanese carrier aviation. As the strike groups disappeared toward the western horizon, those left behind on the American carriers could only wait and hope that their comrades would return safely. At approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, as the sun approached the horizon and painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, lookouts on the Japanese ships suddenly began shouting warnings and pointing toward the east. Dark shapes were appearing against the sunset, growing larger by the second. The American strike had found them. Alarms sounded throughout the fleet. Ozawa ordered every available fighter into the air, but he had pitifully few planes left to scramble. Only about 35 Zeros managed to get airborne, and they would have to face more than 200 American aircraft. The escorting destroyers and cruisers tightened their formations around the carriers, readying their anti-aircraft guns for the onslaught they knew was coming. The first American squadrons to arrive stumbled across 3 Japanese oilers, large tanker ships that had been trailing behind the main fleet to provide refueling services. These ships, loaded with thousands of tons of highly volatile fuel oil, were extraordinarily vulnerable targets. Some American groups, their fuel running low and uncertain about reaching the carriers even if they struck immediately, decided to attack these oilers rather than searching further for the main fleet. Bombs rained down on the hapless tankers, and within minutes 2 of them were burning fiercely, their superstructures already collapsing from the heat of their own burning cargo. A third oiler broke in half and sank almost immediately after being hit. Columns of flame and smoke rose hundreds of meters into the air, creating beacons visible for dozens of miles. Ozawa, watching from Zuikaku's bridge, could only curse as his precious fuel supplies literally went up in flames. Then the full weight of the American strike fell upon the carriers themselves. Aboard the carrier Hiyo, officers had barely enough time to shout warnings before torpedoes from Avengers launched by USS Belleau Wood came streaking through the water. The Avenger crews had executed a textbook approach, using cloud cover to mask their attack until the last possible moment. At least 2 torpedoes struck Hiyo along her port side, the massive explosions shaking the vessel so violently that equipment was thrown from tables and men were knocked from their feet. Damage control parties rushed to contain the flooding, but fires had already started in multiple locations throughout the ship. The fires spread with terrifying speed, fed by aviation fuel and ammunition stored throughout the vessel. Within an hour, Hiyo was clearly doomed, flames engulfing her from bow to stern and smoke pouring from every opening. A final massive explosion, probably the magazines detonating, ripped the carrier apart. She broke in 2 pieces and sank rapidly, taking 250 sailors with her to the bottom. More than 1,000 survivors were rescued from the water by destroyers, but Hiyo herself was gone, adding to the catastrophic losses Japan had suffered over these 2 days. Other carriers also came under attack, though with less decisive results. Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda all reported being hit or near missed by bombs. Thick smoke rose from their flight decks as fires broke out, but quick action by damage control teams prevented the kind of catastrophic damage that had destroyed Hiyo. Most of the bombs landed close alongside rather than scoring direct hits on vital areas. The carriers were damaged, some seriously, but they remained afloat and capable of steaming with the fleet. The battleship Haruna took a direct hit from a bomb on one of her main turrets, the explosion killing and wounding many of the gun crew and putting the turret permanently out of action. Quick thinking by the turret officer who ordered the magazines flooded before the fire could reach them prevented a catastrophic explosion that might have destroyed the entire ship. After about 30 minutes of sustained attack, the American strike groups broke off and headed back toward their carriers. They had inflicted significant damage, sinking 1 carrier and 3 vital oilers while damaging several other major ships. American losses during the attack itself had been minimal, about 20 planes shot down by anti-aircraft fire or Japanese fighters. Ozawa stood on Zuikaku's bridge, surveying his shattered fleet as black smoke billowed from damaged ships and columns of flame marked where the oilers had been. His dream of a decisive victory had turned into a nightmare of unprecedented proportions. For the American aviators, however, their ordeal was just beginning. They now faced the daunting task of finding their carriers in the darkness and attempting to land. At 8:45 in the evening, with full darkness having settled over the ocean, the first returning aircraft appeared in the vicinity of the task force. The pilots, exhausted from hours of flying and the stress of combat, low on fuel and many dealing with battle damage, faced what was arguably the most difficult challenge in carrier aviation, a night landing. Under normal circumstances, carrier landings were difficult and dangerous even in broad daylight. Attempting them at night after such a long mission would test the skills of even the most experienced aviators to their absolute limits. On the carrier Hornet, Rear Admiral Joseph Clark made a bold decision. He ordered the ship's floodlights turned on, illuminating the flight deck despite the fact that this would make the ship highly visible to any Japanese submarines that might be in the area. Mitscher, observing Clark's decision, made an even bolder choice. He ordered the entire fleet illuminated, every carrier to turn on its lights and guide the returning pilots home. It was an extraordinary risk. Japanese submarines were definitely operating in the area, as demonstrated by the sinking of Taiho and Shokaku. A fully illuminated fleet would be an easy target, but Mitchell was willing to accept that risk if it meant saving his pilots. Searchlights swept across the night sky, their brilliant beams creating pathways for the returning aircraft to follow. Destroyers fired star shells and flares, adding more illumination to the scene and marking the location of the fleet. One by one, exhausted pilots brought their aircraft down, many landing on the first carrier they saw rather than trying to find their assigned ship in the confusion. Some landings were textbook perfect, others were controlled crashes that damaged aircraft but left the pilots alive. Some planes, their fuel completely exhausted, crashed into the water short of the carriers. Others attempted to land but misjudged their approaches and crashed on deck or went over the side. Rescue operations continued throughout the night. Destroyers crisscrossed the area, their searchlights playing across the dark water in search of downed airmen. Life rafts were spotted and survivors were pulled aboard, shivering and exhausted but alive. By dawn, the full accounting revealed that 80 aircraft had been lost to crashes or fuel exhaustion during the return flight. It was a heavy toll, but remarkably, about 3/4 of the aircrews survived. Most of those who ditched in the water or parachuted when their fuel ran out were eventually picked up by the extensive search and rescue operations. Mitchell, while deeply concerned about the losses, understood that this was the price of his gamble. By choosing to attack at extreme range in failing light, he had accepted that recovering the aircraft would be difficult and dangerous. That same night, far away in Japan at the Combined Fleet headquarters, Admiral Toyoda received the final reports from the battle. There was no way to disguise or minimize the disaster. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had ended in complete and utter defeat for Japan. Toyoda, a realistic officer who understood the mathematical realities of naval warfare, issued orders for Ozawa to withdraw. There was no point in continuing the operation. The American fleet had won decisively, and any further combat would only result in additional losses that Japan could not afford. The American fleet briefly pursued but then halted, having secured their victory and fulfilled their primary mission of protecting the Saipan landings. There was no need to chase the retreating Japanese halfway across the Pacific. The battle was over, and the results spoke for themselves. After 2 days of intense combat, the Philippine Sea had witnessed the largest carrier battle in naval history. The numbers were staggering and told a story of complete American dominance. Japan had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 separate attack waves over the course of the battle. Of these, only 130 returned to their carriers, and many of those were subsequently lost when their ships were sunk or were so badly damaged they could never fly combat missions again. Including the land-based aircraft from Guam and Rota and factoring in the losses from submarine attacks on the carriers themselves, Japan's total casualties ranged between 475 and 550 aircraft destroyed. Virtually the entire elite corps of Japanese naval aviators had been wiped out in just 2 days. Ozawa's carrier force, which had begun the battle with approximately 500 operational aircraft, was left with barely 35 flyable planes by the end. In terms of ships, the toll was equally devastating. 3 fleet carriers had been sunk, Taiho, Shokaku and Hyo, representing an enormous loss of combat capability and industrial investment. The surviving carriers were damaged to varying degrees and would require extensive repairs. 2 fleet oilers had also been destroyed, creating serious logistics problems for future operations. Most importantly, thousands of trained pilots, aircrew and ship's crew had been killed. The pilots especially represented an irreplaceable loss. It takes years to train a competent naval aviator, and Japan no longer had the time, fuel, or experienced instructors needed to rebuild its carrier air groups to anything approaching their former quality. American losses, by contrast, were almost negligible in comparison. Not a single ship had been sunk. The battleship South Dakota had suffered moderate damage from that one bomb hit but remained fully operational. A handful of other vessels had minor damage from near misses. In total, 123 aircraft had been lost, but the majority of those losses occurred during the difficult night recovery operations rather than in actual combat. The pilots had proven the superiority of their training, equipment, and tactics in every engagement. The fleet had demonstrated that its defensive systems, combining radar-directed fighters with massive anti-aircraft firepower, could defeat even the largest aerial attacks. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, forever remembered with its sardonic nickname of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, had delivered a mortal blow to Japanese naval aviation from which it would never recover. In just 2 days of combat, the elite of Japan's carrier air power had been annihilated, along with thousands of experienced pilots and crew members. The Japanese combined fleet would never again be able to assemble a carrier force strong enough or skilled enough to challenge American naval dominance in the Pacific. 4 months later, in October 1944, the consequences of this defeat would become even more painfully apparent. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement of the entire war, Ozawa would still nominally command Japan's carrier force, but his carriers would sail into battle with virtually no aircraft aboard. They had become nothing more than expensive decoys, sacrificial pawns sent north to draw the American carriers away from the actual invasion fleet. It was a desperate and tragic ending for what had once been the most powerful carrier force in the world. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had rampaged across the Pacific in the opening months of the war, were reduced to sailing as bait, hoping to die in a way that might give their comrades a chance to achieve something before the inevitable end. Strategically, the American victory at the Philippine Sea opened the door for the complete conquest of the Mariana Islands. Within weeks of the battle, Saipan fell to American forces after brutal fighting that cost thousands of lives on both sides. The island's capture tore a fatal breach in Japan's so-called absolute defense line. The inner perimeter that military planners had promised could never be penetrated. With Saipan in American hands, construction of massive air bases began immediately. Soon, flights of B-29 Superfortress bombers were taking off from runways on Saipan, Tinian and Guam, heading north toward Japan with tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs. The strategic bombing campaign that the Japanese High Command had feared became a terrible reality. Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, proved horrifyingly vulnerable to incendiary attacks. One raid after another reduced urban areas to burning rubble, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroying the industrial capacity that Japan needed to continue the war. The pathway to this devastation had been opened by the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American carrier aviation had proven its absolute supremacy and eliminated the last force capable of contesting American operations in the Pacific. In every sense, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 marked the confirmation of America's total naval dominance in the Pacific theater and signaled the inevitable decline and eventual destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the Second World War. The Turkey Shoot had not just been a tactical victory or even an operational success. It had been a strategic turning point, the moment when Japan's last hopes of achieving any kind of favourable outcome to the war were extinguished in the skies above the Philippine Sea. From that point forward, it was only a matter of time before the inexorable advance of American power would reach the Japanese homeland itself, bringing the war to its final, catastrophic conclusion.